We're so glad you joined us today. All thy works, so praise your name. Today we want to worship and we want to praise our God, the one who is holy, holy, holy. Day and night, the four creatures never stop saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. We will worship him too for eternity, starting now. His praise will ever be on our lips.
Today, I want to look at just one verse, one statement of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, and it's a famous one. In fact, it's so famous, we could just talk about the history that has come from this phrase, and we'll do a little bit of that. But the golden rule of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, is what we're going to look at today together. Let me read it for you. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Now, a little of the history. There's a question that came from this phrase. It's also a well-known question. What would Jesus do? In the 1990s in Michigan, a youth leader was trying to help her youth understand how to imitate Jesus. What do? How can you make this practical? And so she came with this question to them. What would Jesus do? And the acronym WWJD. Well, she had no idea what would spring from this, and I don't know all the details of how it happened, but from that one youth group in Michigan sprung a continental campaign where WWJD was all over the church for a year or so. It was in bracelets. It was in all sorts of paraphernalia. And it was a great question. A tool of how do we make following Jesus understandable and doable, breaking it down to a practical level, which was the very goal that this youth leader had for the youth in her group. And the question, really, the impetus came for her from a book it was written in 1896 by a Kansas pastor named Charles Sheldon. He wrote a book called In His Steps. You may be familiar with that book. In fact, as of 2017, it was one of the top 50 best-selling books of all time. And in this book, Charles Sheldon, a pastor, wrote about a fictional pastor who, at the beginning of the book, is confronted by a homeless man. And this homeless man, let me just read to you a portion of this book. And now this is the homeless man speaking to this fictional pastor. I heard some people singing at a church prayer meeting the other night. All for Jesus, all for Jesus, all my being's ransom powers, all my thoughts and all my doings, all my days and all my hours. And I kept wondering as I sat on the steps outside, just what they meant by that. It seems to me there's an awful lot of trouble in the world that somehow wouldn't exist if all the people who sing such songs went out and lived these words out. I suppose I don't understand. But what would Jesus do? Is that what you mean by following his steps? It seems to me sometimes as if the people in the big churches, the ones who have the good clothes and nice homes to live in and money to spend for luxuries and can go away on summer vacations and all that, while the people outside the churches, thousands of them, die in tenements and walk the streets for jobs and never had a piano or a picture in the house and grow up in misery and drunkenness and sin. In the book, the words of this homeless man, they challenged the pastor. And then the pastor began to challenge people in his church to ask themselves the question, what would Jesus do? And then prompt them to respond as they thought Jesus would do. But this was not unique to Charles Sheldon. In 1891, Charles Spurgeon, he famously gave a sermon. It's one of his most well-known sermons. He repeatedly asked the question, what would Jesus do? And his sermon was based off of a devotional book that was written originally in the 1400s called The Imitation of Christ by a man or a group of monks who collectively were known as Thomas à Kempis. I've read The Imitation of Christ a number of years ago, and it is just fascinating to me to read a book written 600 years ago. And while the language is a little different and it can be a little awkward at times to exactly what they're saying, but the questions are the same. as followers of Jesus, we've been asking ourselves the same question since the ascension of Jesus. Jesus, what would you have me do? Jesus, how do I follow Jesus in practical ways? And see, we want to make, as followers of Jesus, walking in Jesus' steps, following the Holy Spirit, understandable and doable. And so we really often do two things. One is we expand on the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. I mean, the New Testament writers do this, for example. Paul will talk theology for part of his letters, and then there's a group of instructions. James has a number of instructions of what living like Jesus practically looks like in different situations between rich and poor people, for example, or Paul, husbands and wives, or children and parents, or slaves and masters in his culture. We expand on the core teachings of Jesus in the Bible. And we also at the same time will distill or summarize the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. For example, what would Jesus do? That is an attempt to distill down into a practical handle, living out the teachings of Jesus. And the golden rule that Jesus gives here is a summary, is a distillation. The Jews in Jesus' day were doing the same things with the laws of Moses. They saw 613 laws giving guidance from God on how to live, and they expanded them in the traditions and the teachings of the rabbis, because the 613 laws of the Old Testament don't cover every circumstance, let alone today. They didn't then either. And the rabbis were also distilling or trying to summarize the 613 into, well, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus interacted with both of these streams. He critiques the Pharisees, for example, for making their traditions equal or even greater to God's words. But we see Jesus expanding on the laws of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount himself. You have heard it said, do not murder. I say, you have anger against your brother, you're guilty of the same sin. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. I tell you the truth. If you look at a woman lustfully, what is Jesus doing there? He is expanding on two, in this case, of the 10 commandments, two of those 613 laws, and expanding them. Going, it doesn't just apply to certain situations. Here's other situations where the principle here applies. And we also see Jesus distill. He got involved in that great commandment debate. His answer? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself, combining Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, and Leviticus chapter 19 and the second half of verse 18. Now, just a quick side comment. There is a dark side, potentially, to this expansion practice and the distilling practice. We can expand, like the Pharisees did, into a legalistic approach to God, where our performance is what matters, and that's the basis for our standing with God. Or a legalism where it's all about following rules and we forget about being connected to the rule or the lawgiver. There's also a dark side to the distillation or the summarizing, where we can start excluding things that maybe we don't like or don't want, and just summarizing things in a way where we forget to look at the whole of the teaching to make sure we're applying our distillation in right and good and healthy ways. See, we need both. We need both the expansion side to deal with all the individual circumstances and relationships and people we will deal with, even how to love your neighbor as yourself. I have different neighbors than you. I'm going to need some different ideas. I'm going to be doing this in different ways than you may be with your neighbors. We need that expansion. But having that distillation, love your neighbor as yourself, for example, is helpful to start making it practical, understandable, and doable. The golden rule that Jesus gives here is that distillation. He said of the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets, that's a Jewish phrase at the time for the whole of the Old Testament, but not just the letters on the page or the books themselves, but all the teaching that is contained within, God's revealed will for how to live. And Jesus begins that golden rule by saying, in everything. In other words, there are no exemptions, there are no exclusions, there are no exceptions. There's no situation in our life where this rule does not apply. Do unto others what you would have them do for you. And again, that's not Jesus' only distilling statement. I mentioned his other famous one already, his answer to what is the greatest commandment. Matthew 23, verses 37 through 40 is his answer, and let me read that to you. You must love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Both of these statements, the golden rule, the great commandment, they summarize the entire law and the prophets, basically saying all the rest is really commentary on what these two things mean: how to love God, what loving God looks like, and how we love our neighbor. But both statements not only assume or make a claim to summarize the entirety of God's revealed will for how he calls us to live, they also have a common assumption that we love ourselves. And this assumption is the hook that helps us know how to practically love our neighbor. And by loving our neighbor, we are obeying God and loving him. In the Bible, we see the command, love God. It's all over the place. We see the command to love our neighbors, to love others, to love even our enemies. There is never a command in the Bible to love ourselves. It's because the teaching of the Bible already assumes we do. Now, by loving ourselves, what is meant that is we know how to take care of ourselves. We know how to look after ourselves, at least our own needs, our own wants, our desires. Now, we're fallen human beings. We get it wrong at what we need, what we should desire. We may go about fulfilling our needs, our wants, our desires in wrong ways, in destructive ways. But even in our destructive behavior, what we are showing is I'm trying to take care of me. I want something. I need something. It could be an emotional need, financial need, physical need, relational need. I want to have something, and I'm going to act in a way to get it. We may be mistaken at what will satisfy ourselves, but we still act in a way to satisfy those needs. Our problem as human beings is not about a failure to care or love ourselves. Our failure in this area as human beings is we often, by ourselves, with our own wisdom, our own thinking, we don't do it right. We don't do it well. And that's part of what God comes to teach us through Jesus. How to love ourselves rightly, how to see ourselves rightly as he loves and sees us. Jesus came to demonstrate God's love for us and God's view of us. Whether we are sinners in rebellion against him, God demonstrates his own love for us while we are still sinners. And God also demonstrates his love and his view for us for those who have been adopted and welcomed his invitation to life with him, accepted it, embraced it. And we see his love in how he views us. God wants us to love ourselves rightly for a number of reasons, including the reason that if and when we are not loving ourselves well, we will struggle to love others around us well. We have a saying, hurt people hurt people. This reflects this simple truth that hurt people will hurt those around them because they're struggling to love themselves rightly and well. And in that pain, in that inability to love themselves well, struggle to love others around them well. The New Testament writers following Jesus riff regularly on Jesus' summary statement here of the Golden Rule. Let me read a few from the New Testament. First, starting in James chapter 2, verse 8. Yes, indeed, It is good when you obey the royal law found in the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. Then Paul in Romans 13:8-10. Owe nothing to anyone except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. For the commandments say you must not commit adultery, you must not murder, you must not steal, you must not covet. These and other such commandments are summed up in this one commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to others, so love fulfills the requirements of the law. Galatians, for you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, some of you may be going, wait a second. They're leaving out half of Jesus' great commandment. Where's love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength? Where's that, Paul? Where's that, James? They're not leaving it out. In fact, they're assuming it. Remember who these people were writing to. They were writing to churches. They were writing to followers of Jesus. They were writing to those who had already surrendered their kingdoms to Jesus out of a love for Jesus and a desire to live in love for Jesus and God. But the emphasis that James and Paul, and as we'll see in a few moments, John, see, they diagnose a problem that we forget all too easily. Because it is possible for us as Christians, as people who want to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we fail to remember the direct connection Jesus made between loving God and loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. See, it's possible to deceive ourselves and to tell ourselves, no, I love God. I'm good with God. I'm obeying God. And actually disconnect how we are treating those around us. All of those around us. Here's a simple recipe. It's not the only one, but this one will work. If you just want to love God, feel comfortable about your love of God, but actually be completely out of step with what He's called us to do and how to live. Read the Bible. Take your favorite list of commands, which usually will be the ones that you don't struggle with living out. Emphasize those. Value those as the ones that God really is concerned about. And minimize the rest, especially the ones that you struggle with. And so repentance doesn't need to be a regular practice because you're already doing the ones that God really cares about. And then add a few practices. Go to church. Read your Bible daily. Pray to God. Do things that don't require you to engage in the lives of other people around you in meaningful ways at deep levels. And then add a theology that believes, or at least practices, that faith is all about you and Jesus. It's just a personal relationship with Jesus and not being in community, not mentoring others, not making yourself vulnerable to a few people, allowing them to see what's going on inside, or not allowing yourself to be exposed to what's going on in the lives of others at a deep, meaningful, relational, emotional, spiritual level. Put those together, and I guarantee you will comfortably believe that you love God. You will struggle with those around you that just don't love God the same way and to the degree that you do. And all that while, you will be completely failing to love God as God has asked you to love Him. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 21. I encourage you to read this passage because it will make this dynamic clear. But let me just read the last two verses of John 4, 7 to 21. If someone says, I love God, but hates a Christian brother or sister, that person is a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? And he has given us this command: those who love God must also love their Christian brothers or sisters. See, our love for God is shown in practical ways to those that we love around us, or in love to those around us. We can't separate, as Jesus in the Great Commandment said, the second is like it. The first command, love the Lord your God. The second command is equal to it. It can't be separated. In fact, they will show you the level of each other. There goes my phone. Just the joy of recording at home, folks. Love of God and love of people are linked. You cannot have one without the other. And this is what makes the golden rule dangerously practical for us. It will test our claim of allegiance to Jesus because it will call us to take that innate self-care instinct that we have and call us to extend it to others, to our family, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, to groups of people that we don't like, to groups of people we don't understand, to those that we feel are our enemies. Because after all, we don't like to think of ourselves that we've positioned ourselves as enemies of anyone. The golden rule makes it imminently and dangerously practical. But that's what Jesus did. Think of his life. What did Jesus do? He did for others what he would want done for him. And so I'm just going to run through some acronyms to close. The first, WWJD. What would Jesus do? That is a great question. And that's a good start for us. But to do this well, we need a few other acronyms. So the next one I have for you is GITS. G-I-T-S. Get in their shoes. When we're looking at our neighbor, when we're looking at another person and asking ourselves, what would Jesus do for them? We're asking, Jesus, what do you want me to do for them? We need to be listening to the voice of God, listening to their voice. What needs do they have? How would they receive love in this case? We don't have to fully agree with what that may be. We don't have to fully agree with what they say their immediate need is. But listen to the situation, listen to the voice of God, but asking ourselves, if I was in their shoes, if I was in their place, how would I want to be treated? What would I need? And that's the third acronym, WWIW. What would I want? If I were in their shoes, what would I want done for me? And then frog. Yep, frog. Fully rely on God. Because there's times answering these previous questions is going to lead to an answer that's going to be difficult. It's going to lead to a situation where you feel out of your depths. It should. Because God is looking to reveal himself through you. Not just who you are, but who he is. And we need him to do that through us. Think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? Jesus said there's a man who's on the road to Jericho, a well-known, dangerous road. He is attacked by robbers, stripped naked, beaten, left for dead on the side of the road. Priest comes by, walks on the other side of the road, leaving the man in the dirt. A Levite, someone who was also responsible for teaching and leading the people of God to follow the commands of God, walks by on the other side of the road, leaving the man left there. The Samaritan, the one Jesus' audience would have looked down upon culturally. The Samaritan looks at the man on the road and, in a way, ask the question, well, what would Jesus do? What would God do? He puts himself in the place of the other man. He gets in that person's shoes. If I was beaten, stripped naked, left for dead on the side of the road, what would I want a traveler passing by to do? What would I want? And so, makes an act of trust. Could be a ploy. Could be a trap. The robbers could still be around. The time I take here might be dangerous for me. But he puts his trust in God. Takes the man onto his donkey, takes him to the inn, leaves money there with the innkeeper, and a promise that if this is not enough, I'll pay the balance when I get back. Because that's how the Samaritan would have wanted to be treated. That's how Jesus would have treated the person. That's what Jesus did for us. He came from heaven. He stooped, became one of us, because we could not rescue ourselves from how poorly we do love ourselves, left to our own devices. And he rescues. He's rescued us. He's looking to continue to rescue us from ourselves and teach us how to love ourselves rightly so we can love others rightly. And by doing that, we will obey the command of God and love him rightly. Jesus told his disciples in his last conversation before the cross, if you love me, obey my commands. And later on in John, he said, this is my command. Love each other. In fact, he said that's how the world will know that we are his followers, by our love for one another. So my last acronym is just this, WWYD. What will you do? What will help you to ask yourselves these questions? What would Jesus do? How can I get into their shoes to listen to them? What would I want if I'm in their situation? And then, God, I need to fully rely on you in this. What will you do? If you want, bracelets are available on Amazon. You can get a package of 12, one for every month, $15. Or maybe it's just a sticker you put on your mirror in your bathroom, or something you stick in your wallet or your purse, just to remind you to regularly, whenever you're engaging with someone, whenever you see a need, what would Jesus do? Listen to where that person is at. Listen to what God is saying in the midst of that situation. Ask yourself, what would I want if I was in their shoes? And then, like the Samaritan, maybe we need to get off our donkey and help one another out. We need to rely on God in this. We need to work together in this. We need Jesus to help us in everything do unto others what we would have them do to and for us. It's a challenging statement, but it's one that's at the heart of following Jesus in his steps. God bless.
I've got a river of life flowing out of me, makes the lame to walk and the blind to see, opens prison doors, sets the captives free. I've got a river of life flowing out of me, spring up a well within my soul, spring up a well and make me whole, spring up a well and give to me I've got a river of life flowing out of me. Makes the lame to walk and the blind to see. Open prison doors, sets the captive free. Oh, I've got a river of life flowing out of me. Spring up a well within my soul. Spring up a well and make me whole. Spring up a well and give to me that life abundantly.
Lord, may you bring up a wellspring of life in your people this week. May your abundant greatness be displayed for all to see and all to believe that Abba Father is God and Christ is King.